in 2025. This morning we have apologies from George Adam and Keith Brown, and we welcome back to committee Jackie Dunbar. Welcome, Mr Dunbar. We also have Mr Alexander, Deputy Convener, who is on parliamentary business lodging amendments for Stage 2 of the Housing Bill and will join us if parliamentary business allows. Our first agenda item is decision on whether to take item 3 in private. Are we agreed? Yes. Thank you. And our second agenda item is to take evidence for the final time on the second phase of our inquiry in relation to the review of the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And we welcome to committee this morning Angus Robertson, Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture, Elliot Robertson, Head of EU Secretariat of External Affairs, Rachel Sutherland, Deputy Director of Population and Migration, and joining us from Brussels, Dr Frank Muschler, Head of Research, EU Office in the Scottish Government, and a warm welcome to you all. Cabinet Secretary, can I invite you to make an opening statement?
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, colleagues. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to the committee again on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and to focus today on trade and services and on mobility. I welcome the committee's inquiry. Your previous report on trade and goods made a strong contribution to the debate on the impact of Brexit. The Scottish Government's view is well known. The provisions made under the TCA represent a huge backward step when compared to the benefits of European Union membership. The changed international and UK economic situation now demand, in turn, an urgent change of course by the UK Government. It's becoming clearer by the day that being outside the European Union is the more volatile world leaves the UK and Scotland in an exposed and a vulnerable position. We've seen further evidence this week of the precarious position of the UK economy, and in these circumstances, continuing the disastrous UK self-imposed exclusion from the European single market and customs union makes zero sense. There are clear moves towards greater European Union economic autonomy, and that means that in the midst of a possible global trade war, the UK is running the risk of being marooned with no safe harbour. That cannot be in the interests of Scotland. Within the parameters of the TCA, there are still some limited improvements that are possible. In respect to the trade and services, greater worker mobility and mutual recognition of professional qualifications in key sectors would help. The loss of mobility has had a particular impact on touring artists. Rejoining the Erasmus Plus programme would make it easier for our young people and students to study in the European Union and enhance their skills and their qualifications. And the Scottish Government will continue to press for improvements to arrangements for cooperation with the European Union, and to be clear, this means provisions that are much deeper and much wider reaching. From the evidence that you've taken so far, it's clear that the Scottish Government's priorities coincide in very many cases with the priorities of stakeholders in business, education and civil society. So in particular, it is critical that we come to a comprehensive and a generous mobility agreement as swift as possible and seek to rejoin key European programmes in order to redress harms and restore to our businesses and individuals at least some of what they have lost through Brexit. To this effect, both I and my ministerial colleagues will continue to work with key partners in Scotland on the proposed efforts to improve UK-EU relations. I expect to have a further meeting of the Four Nations Interministerial Group on UK-EU relations to press for Scotland's interests, and I've offered to host that meeting on an in-person basis in Scotland. I've also recently travelled to Brussels to speak with key European Union partners as the EU continues to embed its new 5-year cycle. To finish, I remain committed to working closely with our fellow Europeans to the good of Scotland, the rest of the UK and the European Union, and to that end I look forward to discussing these issues with you and other matters members may wish to raise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. If I could open with a question. In the annex of your letter that you provided to committee, you say the lack of progress in a number of key policy priorities is clearly disappointing, and goes on to describe the limits of the Standing Committee process. What are your expectations for what comes next from the forthcoming UK-EU Summit and the TCA Partnership Council meeting, and going into the next round of the Standing Committees, what would you like to see differently?
Well, I think it's fair to observe two things. One, there hasn't been significant progress thus far between the UK and the European Union, but it's also fair to say that at this stage there are preparations underway in Brussels, in London and in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast in relation to forthcoming meetings where more substantive progress can be made. And that's the stage that we're at. So I observe that the UK government has been taking the issue more seriously within government, and that's welcome. There have been changes in machinery in the UK government to deal with that. And there is a new Cabinet Committee on Europe, which is chaired by the Prime Minister. So the UK is clearly thinking about what is coming up. I think it would be remiss to not draw attention to the changing geostrategic peril that we all feel in Europe at the present time. And that is a dimension that perhaps will loom larger in everybody's considerations here and in the other capitals in the considerations of how we work together. So what can I imagine will be coming up? I can imagine that both the United Kingdom and the European Union would be focused on advancing shared interests on defence and security. So we would very much welcome for there to be a joint statement on cooperation in this area. I note overnight that the European Union has announced a very significant defence package, which is not open to United Kingdom, the United Kingdom defence sector, and that might change were there to be a cooperation agreement between the UK and the European Union. So I think that is strong encouragement for that to happen, although I think there's goodwill on all sides to try and make progress in that area. For the Scottish Government's part, we have, for the longest of times, advanced the need for, well, I think you've heard me make this point before, what I call a food, drink and agriculture agreement. The terminology is important because people might actually understand what that is as opposed to an SPS agreement. But for those of us who have been speaking with our food and drink sector, our rural stakeholders, I think there's a general view that it's very important that we should have an agreement like that, and we've been impressing that on the UK government, and we have been sharing that view with European Union interlocutors. There are other areas of common interest to the UK and the European Union, greater cooperation on energy, on law enforcement, addressing irregular migration, perhaps something like the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention, for example. All of these are things that may feature, and both sides have particular issues that may well be raised as part of this process. I think there's an expectation that the European Union is very keen to make progress on youth mobility, and we would share their interests in that. No doubt we can come back to that. I think there's an expectation, although no details about what this might involve, but in relation to fishing issues. And we very much hope that the UK government will push for both business mobility and mobility for touring artists. So we expect negotiations to continue over the summer after the forthcoming summit. We're not aware of discussions between the parties as yet on the timing of the next Partnership Council or the spring round of specialised committees, but I think we are at the cusp of some progress, and we have been making our priorities very clear, and no doubt we can go into that in some detail. And in fairness to my opposite number in the UK government, he's been stressing to me, sorry, this is Nick Simon-Thomas, impressing on me and also impressing on colleagues in Wales and Northern Ireland that the UK government wants to take the priorities of devolved administration seriously. We are taking that at face value, and we very much hope that progress can be made on those as well as the other areas that will be discussed.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'd also like to ask a question, which an area you've already mentioned, and that's mobility, particularly youth mobility. We recently heard from young people who face the challenges of studying in the EU outside the Erasmus scheme, and also from our culture sector about the impact on touring artists, both of which you've mentioned already. So what would you like to say to the young Scots who feel their life experiences are being damaged at the moment, and what do you think might benefit them should we, as the UK, go back into Creative Europe?
So I think it has been massively detrimental to young people that the UK left Erasmus+. We remember, of course, at that time that the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson gave an assurance to the House of Commons that that would not be the case. He said the UK would remain within Erasmus+ and lauded what it had delivered for young people. And on that, I agree with him. I'll come back to that in a bit more after going on to culture. But I think the Erasmus+ withdrawal, which didn't need to happen, was unnecessary and is self-harm in terms of younger people's life chances. Secondly, on Creative Europe, similarly, UK didn't need to leave Creative Europe. Speak to anybody in the Scotland's creative community, and they are absolutely clear that they would wish Scotland and the UK to be part of Creative Europe. They look at other third countries that are members of Creative Europe. They see that they are able to benefit from being part of it, don't understand why the UK is not. And I would strongly, strongly encourage the UK government to look at both of these areas as the last UK government did in relation to Horizon, because that is a similar programme, in that case for university and wider research, where I think there was an acknowledgement that it was a big mistake to leave it. The university sector were very keen to go back into Horizon, and the last UK Conservative government realised that it was a programme that one could play a part in again. And I see Erasmus Plus and I see Creative Europe in exactly the same way. There's a willingness from European Union countries and institutions to see the UK back, and I would very much wish that to be the case, because for young people and people in our creative sector, it would go a long way to ending the self-harm that we've had to endure since Brexit. But on a more positive note, would be able to mend, to rebuild educational opportunity and international cooperation, both for young people studying and learning, and also for our creative sector.
Thank you very much. Going to open to questions from members. I'll take Mr Harvey first.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning. I'd like to start off by asking about the process issues between the governments that you mentioned, and then I'll come back to the youth mobility question as a specific instance. The word reset gets thrown around a bit easily, both in terms of a reset with the European Union and the idea of the UK wanting a reset in its relations with the other governments of the UK. I'm not sure anyone's really quite pinned down what they mean by reset yet in either of those spheres. But I'd like to ask you to what extent you think it is already happening. Is the UK government's approach to these questions, the TCA and how it develops, is it being generated as a result of a facilitated discussion between the governments of the UK and the other voices within the UK, or is the intergovernmental discussion effectively telling you what the UK government's position is going to be?
So firstly, welcome back to the committee, Mr Harvey.
Thank you.
Nice to see you in your place. And I'll give my civil service colleagues the opportunity to collect any thoughts or reflections that they may have, because as committee members will appreciate, most of the work that is done in preparation and as part of these processes is driven at a working level. officials speaking to one another regularly about things. Happily talk about my experience in dealing with UK government colleagues and European interlocutors as part of the process as well, though. In terms of reset, reset isn't really liked as a term in Brussels. But I think we all understand what is meant by that. That previously more fraught intergovernmental relations between the UK and the European Union should be less fraught, should be more positively aligned. And incidentally, that should also be an approach between the UK government and the devolved administrations in the UK, because those relations had been very bad under the last UK government. And when I have met with colleagues in Brussels, they have reported that there is definitely a different approach from what's now not a bit less of a new government, but the still relatively new UK government, in its discussions with the European Union. And I would attest to the fact that the meetings that I have had, it's constantly stressed that we're in different territory, that one wants to listen. Now, so far so good with all of that. I don't think Mr. Harvey was on the committee when I shared this insight of people on Brussels who, described the UK government as being the Spice Girls position. I'm judging by Mr. Harvey's face that he hasn't heard this before, where European Union colleagues were saying that what they weren't sure about was what the UK government really wanted. Tell us what you want, tell us what you really, really want. And this was sort of the chat amongst everybody at events. It's great, UK government ministers are having conversations, saying one wants to get on positively. One is exploring various areas in which there may be discussions, where there may be agreement, but a lack of clarity about what the UK government actually wanted. Now, in fairness, a new government comes in, they have to understand where did the last government get to, where are interlocutors in Brussels and Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast in all of that, and work out what are the relative priorities of things. And the European Union, for its own part, European Parliament elections, a new commission, new commissioners taking up their responsibilities. I think everybody has sort of chosen to understand that backdrop as the reasons why one hasn't made substantive progress on all of these things yet. And we have wished it fair wind, but I would also characterise the conversations that I've had and the clearly expressed and repeatedly so views of colleagues. I met Lisa Nandy, my UK Culture Minister, opposite number yesterday, and it's how she started the conversation. UK government's very keen to work with the Scottish Government. Let's make sure we can identify, and all of that, great, but we're getting to the stage beyond terms like reset and about atmospherics. What is one actually going to seek to agree, and when? And at the same time, I think also bear in mind that we now have had this massive black swan that has crossed in front of everybody's considerations in relation to defence and security. Now, perhaps that will help everybody, if they didn't already realise it, understand why these areas of potential agreement, they do really matter. It does really matter that one has goodwill, that there will be different interests in those discussions. And I have to really hope that, and it's been reported back to us, that the UK government has taken our positions back. I've said it to the committee before, but just so it's on the record. Improving professional mobility, securing EU-UK cooperation on the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, rejoining Erasmus Plus and improving youth mobility, removing obstacles for touring artists and improving migration arrangements to meet Scottish needs. And in no particular order, incidentally. These are all things that we've asked the UK government to take seriously.
What I'm driving at, Cabinet Secretary, is not to ask you if you know what the UK government really, really wants yet, but in determining what it wants, is there something akin to a co-decision-making process emerging between the governments of the UK, or is that are you in the position of lobbying someone else who will make the decision, or is there a process of deciding together what our shared priorities are?
No, there's not a co-decision mechanism in the United Kingdom, and that's not how the devolution settlement works. Sadly, that of course was the advantage of the European Union. As a member state of the European Union, we were formerly part of a co-decision process, and that co-decision process also involved directly elected parliamentarians as part of the process as well. We don't have that. We have an assurance that one will listen to the priorities of the Scottish Government, Welsh Government and the Northern Irish Executive, and one that will inform the UK's negotiating position. But there is no formal mechanism for decisions being made jointly in any way whatsoever. Now, that
approach which seeks to achieve that, or are we in a process that's fundamentally unchanged?
I do remember that the Scottish electorate being promised the closest possible thing to federalism, and that's how these things work. If we're going to have a look at other countries like Germany or Austria that had a federal system, so it involves the lender as part of the decision-making process, including European Union, that is not the case in the UK.
If I can move it then on to the practical example.
Patrick, sorry, Neil's got a supplementary on that area. Bring him in.
Quoted the Spice Girls earlier. The Rolling Stones had a song, you can't always get what you want. And on that issue, in terms of, obviously, when you enter negotiations, there will be need for concessions and compromises on either side. Just to clarify, you mentioned all the issues that the Scottish Government wanted to see in terms of the trade and cooperation agreement. You said in no particular order. I just wondered if the Scottish Government did actually have a priority list. In the same way the UK Government, you recognise the UK Government would be looking at priorities. Has the Scottish Government considered out of that list what the priorities are?
I don't have anything that has got a list of numbers next to the particular points that are raised, but I think it's clear that something like an agriculture, food and drink agreement, an SPS agreement that would have really significant impact across our economy and our rural sector and in terms of our exports is really, really important. Now, I do think that the UK government views that as one of the major priorities. Never been said like that. So we're kind of in a similar position. We're not at the stage of not getting everything that you want. We're not even at a stage of knowing what everybody's relative priorities are, because that's the process. That's the stage of the process that we're currently at. But I've made it absolutely clear that an agriculture, food and drink agreement is very important. Everything else is significant. I don't see any technical reason or political reason why all of these things are not deliverable. What the European Union's position on things are going to be, I can't speak to. I do know that they're very keen on mobility as an issue, so young people from the European Union and the United Kingdom can enjoy the benefits of living, work, studying in one another's countries, and I happen to agree with that. But it's too early for me to be able to read the runes for Mr Bibby on what are the relative positions of the UK government. But we have talked about how important all of these things are. I think some of them. All issues will bring advantages and disadvantages for different sides in a negotiation. That much is clear. It does seem to me, though, there are some things as part of this process where I actually don't see any downside whatsoever. Take Creative Europe, for example. I cannot see any downside for the UK being a part of it. There are 13 other states and territories outside the European Union that are part of Creative Europe. And if one speaks to our creative sector here, where cooperation with other parts of Europe is really important, say, take the screen sector, I know that an area that Mr Bibby and I share a commitment to. where co-productions and working with other commissioning broadcasters and film and TV companies is really important. You speak to anybody in that world, they're saying we absolutely need to be back and be part of Creative Europe. Now, I haven't heard a single person in any context in Scotland or the UK question that. Not a single person. So, with a bit of luck, some of these things need not be complicated at all. There are other areas where, take for example, energy, which I haven't mentioned so far, which is also important. Energy matters greatly, obviously, because of the geostrategic situation we find ourselves in, dependencies on the European continent on gas. So countries like Germany are moving as quickly as they can from dependencies on gas to hydrogen. They can't produce enough hydrogen. Who can produce hydrogen? Northern European countries, including Scotland. That is an area where it's really, really important for the UK government to understand that issues around energy really matter to us as well. That's more complicated. I concede that some things are much easier to deliver than others where there are technical questions and these things might take a bit longer. But in principle, I think everything that we've said that should be a priority from our point of view should be eminently deliverable. But the relative order that the UK government or indeed European Union colleagues would give to them, I'm not in a position to answer, but happy to come back later in the process to talk about that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Convener. I was going to move on to youth mobility as a specific example, which you've already touched on briefly, but I was going to use it as an example to understand how the process is working. We've seen conflicting news reports in recent weeks about whether the UK government is changing or preparing to change its position on a youth mobility scheme. Now, no great secret that I would like a maximal answer to that. I think the loss of freedom of movement is tragic. I think it's bad for our economy, for our society, and there's a basic injustice in that a generation of people who enjoyed freedom of movement have deprived the younger generation of that freedom. But in reality, we're likely to see, if anything, a more modest change, not the full restoration of that freedom, but a more modest change. Is the UK government actively engaging the Scottish government in those discussions and other governments within the UK? Because I hear support for that from the Scottish government. We know that the Welsh government has tried to make progress on youth mobility and wants to do more. We hear employers calling for it. We hear trade unions calling for it. We hear economists calling for it. The range of voices seeking a serious youth mobility scheme is very broad and diverse. And it seems as though the only voice in the room that is unwilling to say again where it's going to go with this is the UK government. So is that a discussion on which that decision about where the UK should go being reached collectively with the voice of the Scottish government and other Scottish voices being heard or not?
Well, I think our position has definitely been heard. I know that because the Minister in question has acknowledged that these priorities that we share and other devolved governments in the UK share are things that have been listened to. We're all political practitioners, so I think we also have to acknowledge that the UK government is wrestling with how to deal with immigration as an issue and is feeling the political heat from the populist right. I think that in significant part is a reason why there is nervousness in the UK government about anything that might create an impression that the doors are being opened to more people to arrive, if I can put it like that, in a way which that is not, I think, where the debate about mobility or migration is in Scotland. It is just a different reality. And that is where I do see a danger in relation to mobility and migration from a Scottish point of view, which is it is simply relegated in importance because of the UK government's political position on the issue. Now, this kind of goes back a little bit to Mr Bibby's question about what are different people's position as part of the discussions. I can foresee circumstances where a UK government might say, oh, we want an agriculture, food and drink agreement, an SPS agreement, and the European Union says that's very interesting. We're not disinterested in doing such a thing, but we're very interested in a mobility agreement for young people. And that is an example of where one might see different relative priorities from the European Union and the UK. It would just happen to be on that question that the Scottish Government's position is more aligned with that of the European Union. Now, are we formally part of that trade-off, if I can call it that? No, we're not. And should we be? Absolutely, yes, we should. That's what happens in other European countries. And it's something that was promised, of course, was it not, to the electorate here, that we should be in the closest to a federal position, and that is what a federal form of government involves. Now, having said that, I'm a pragmatist. I want to make sure that if I can encourage UK government colleagues to understand that this is a really good thing, to realise the damage that has been done in limiting young people's opportunities, what this is doing in our universities, what is happening in our schools, almost totally bereft of language assistance, just as one example of the end of the freedom of movement and is a thoroughly bad thing. These are things that could be remedied through a mobility agreement, and I think the UK government is trying to, if it is going to have to agree to something like that, wants it to sound more limited than giving the impression of something being too wide.
One of the issues which the UK government appears to have floated in briefing certain parts of the press to report where they might be going with this is directly relevant to devolved responsibilities. It's around access to the NHS. That if there was a youth mobility scheme, it would involve big upfront fees for the participants in order to access healthcare. If that was the way the UK government went, if that was what they wanted to achieve, it would clearly require a degree of negotiation with the UK, with the Scottish Government around devolved responsibilities. Can we seek your assurance that the Scottish Government's position will not be to commoditise access to healthcare in that way, and that the Scottish Government would always argue against upfront fees for young people who are being welcomed to this country to be able to access healthcare?
Well, I'm in favour of a public health system where it's free at the point of access for anybody that requires healthcare, and I would expect that for young Scottish people anywhere else in Europe. Hope that answers your question.
People coming to Scotland.
Pardon me?
And for young European people coming to Scotland.
That is what I would wish. I would want to maintain the principles that we believe in terms of access to public health that doesn't involve paying for it.
Thank you.
Sorry, my colleague Rachel Summerlin wanted to come in at that point.
Yeah, so the immigration health surcharge is almost all visa routes, including all of the existing youth mobility routes. There's a requirement for individuals who come through that to pay the immigration health surcharge, and that's been a fairly long-standing part of that. The Scottish Government position, as set out, is that we do not think that, as Scottish ministers, do not consider that the immigration health surcharge is a helpful part of the immigration system, because in large part what it requires individuals to do is to pay for health twice, because they're paying through it for their taxation whilst also paying for it through the immigration health surcharge. There's a consequential element of the immigration health surcharge that comes to the NHS in Scotland.
I think the only point to add is that argument is it has a stronger bite, if you like, in relation to a youth mobility scheme, because if somebody's accessing a visa to come for their career, they're expecting to earn money while they're here, whereas somebody is accessing a youth mobility scheme, that's likely to be somebody who doesn't have the resources, and a youth mobility scheme, in order to achieve its objectives, should be open and accessible to the maximum number, not only to those who can come up with the cash.
I'm very sympathetic to the point that Mr Harvey makes. Just a matter of basic principle. I believe in we pay for the health system through our taxes, and we have an intergenerational responsibility, I think. And I would wish that young Scots able to live and work and using a youth mobility scheme in the rest of Europe would not be disadvantaged, and what's true for them would, by necessity, I would hope, be true for Europeans.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Kerr?
Yes. Where to begin? Can we, first of all, ascertain the view of not just you, Cabinet Secretary, but perhaps especially Dr. Frank Mauschler in Brussels? I think he's in Brussels. Has the Windsor Framework Agreement made a difference to the tone of the way things are happening between the UK government and the European Union, in Brussels in particular, the institutions in Brussels? And it's just that I had the opportunity to visit one of our world-class research centres this week, in Scotland, of course, this week, and was heartened to hear from them in terms of research funding, in terms of project lead status and so forth, that since the Windsor Framework Agreement, there's been a complete, almost, change of atmosphere. Can I ask, well, obviously, Cabinet Secretary first, but I'd obviously like to hear from Dr. Mauschler as well.
Sure. I mean, I've made the point already in my evidence this morning that I think there has been a difference in tone, not just because of a new government which is saying that they're keen on a reset, but I mean, I do think, and I've said this, and I've said it not just at this evidence session, I think the last UK Conservative government, which Mr Kerr supported, which was absolutely right to go back into Horizon. Horizon, like many other European programmes, are ones that our institutions were really, really big participants in, disproportionately so relative to the rest of the United Kingdom in many respects. And for me, it's a really, really good reason and rationale, incidentally, why, when we have other programmes which have proven themselves in many different ways. If we take Erasmus+, where we had disproportionate take-up and participants in Erasmus+ in Scotland from more deprived backgrounds relative to the rest of the UK, just as an example. Of course, in terms of headcount and all the rest of it, that too. But I'm just making the point that I think Mr Kerr on this issue is right. It's a rare thing for me to agree with him. Please, can that be minuted to make sure that the record shows this to be so?
I hope the official reporters are catching this.
So I think the logic of Mr Kerr's position is irresistible in as much as what was right for Horizon is right for Erasmus Plus and is right for Creative Europe. These are the three areas where these programmes proved successful whilst in the European Union and have proved successful, proven successful for countries that are participants but no longer, in our case, or not ever part of the European Union as well. And I'm sure that the experience that Mr Kerr had visiting, he didn't name which institution it was, that was singing the praises of increased research funding and cooperation and all of that, is one that I think we would, in years to come, be hearing from participants in Erasmus Plus after the UK were to rejoin it, and that is what we would be hearing from our creative sector were the UK to rejoin Creative Europe.
Well, I mean, I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary. He's saying I'm right about things that he is putting forward. I'm not necessarily wholeheartedly agreeing with everything he says I'm right about, so interesting. But I am interested in the atmosphere. I did want to come to Dr Mauschler because I'm in...
The Cabinet Secretary has given evidence, so the officials are there to support him.
Yes, that's why I asked the Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I'd be delighted to hear from Dr. Mauschler. And I should say, incidentally, this whole discussion that we're having is really important to understand that in our efforts in trying to have cooperative discussions with the UK government and with European Union interlocutors is made significantly easier by having top-class representation both in London, in Scotland House, and top-class representation in Brussels. Incidentally, an office set up by the Conservatives a number of decades ago, and by having a talented team on the ground are best able to understand all of the information that we have to have about these important processes. And so at that point I hand over to Dr Merschler and put on record my appreciation to him and his colleagues in Scotland House and Brussels.
And the Conservative government that set up the office. Brilliant.
Many thanks for the question. So just very briefly, I think it's fair to say that the Windsor Framework implementation is a key factor for the EU, and the steps that were taken to implement that have been warmly welcomed on this side. I think one of the things I would say, it unblocked the Horizon Association, it unblocked a number of other aspects, and that is a signal from the EU of how strongly they feel about this. It is fair to say that throughout, and even now, implementation of the Windsor Framework remains a very high political imperative on the European Union side. And they are constantly evaluating progress, considering this in all aspects of the work they do and in their relationship with the UK government. I think it is fair to say that in correspondence with the European Commission, the number of times that implementation of Windsor Framework has been mentioned is pretty much every exchange. So this is very important for them. The continued implementation, I would argue, is the other factor we must keep in mind as we move forward. I hope that answers the question.
I think that is very helpful. Sorry.
Mr. Kerr, if Mr. Kerr would allow, it does raise an important point of context in relation to that which has followed from the Windsor Agreement, which relates to border controls between the UK and the European Union. And as we know, the UK has not fully implemented a border control regime and will have to. And this is one of the areas where it seems to me, again, enlightened self-interest on everybody's part, I would hope, which is that by having an agriculture, food and drink agreement, if one were able to reach such a thing before the United Kingdom might have to introduce its full border regime, that it would obviate a lot of additional complications for our exporters and indeed those that import as well. And so I think it's important to see in that context that it would be to the advantage of our food, drink and agriculture sector here in Scotland, the rest of the UK and the European Union. And that's where I think there is a virtuous circle in understanding that this is part of a wider process, but it would reduce the risks of greater friction. And you've already had evidence on this committee, I know, when talking in particular about goods, so import and export, that there's already been a significant negative impact. There would be even more negative impact were one to see border controls implemented as the UK government would need to do, were it not for an agriculture, food and drink agreement, an SPS agreement that would obviate a very high percentage of requirements for border controls. And that's why it's in all of our interests as part of this process that we've been talking about here today, that one can reach an agreement in this area.
Well, the Cabinet Secretary knows that I personally believe that we should implement border controls in order to create an appropriate level playing field when it comes to quid pro quo, because at the moment we are not in a particularly strong position when it comes to negotiating things when we haven't implemented the original agreement. But that, I think, we probably might agree on. But I am concerned about the implications of any reopening. Well, let's be clear. The TCA is not going to be reopened. The use of the word reset, I agree, is completely overused and is probably best not repeated. But in this document, which came to us this week from last week's EU-UK Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, there was a bit of it that I would like to ask you about as a Scottish Government Minister as a response, and that was in relation to the element about sanitary and phytosanitary agreements that you rename to the understanding of everyone who listens to you. because it then goes on to say, and of the importance, it's describing the kind of the discussions that are about to happen. It says, and of providing a signal at or before the summit, that's the initial summit that reviews all this, that a fair deal on fisheries will be reached. Now, I read that with some alarm, to be frank, because the Scottish fishing industry is having a bit of a bumper time over the last couple of years. As you will know, record catches in places like Peterhead. I am worried and concerned that we're going to repeat the mistakes of the past when it comes to UK territorial waters and fishing rights access. Would the Cabinet Secretary agree with my concerns? Does he agree that the UK government ought not to be giving away rights that we have only just lately recovered, and the benefit of that agreement being that not only is the fishing industry having a bumper time in terms of catches, but also it's an opportunity for us to invest on the onshore infrastructure that comes with fishing, particularly around processing?
So the first thing that I'd want to say to Mr Kerr is I'd be very keen that we wouldn't want to rewrite history and the facts around fishing, because it is not as Mr Kerr has presented it. Brexit left the Scottish fishing industry with access to fewer of important fish stocks than under the Common Fisheries Policy. The industry group Salmon Scotland reported that Brexit cost Scotland around £75 million in 2023 in lost salmon exports to the European Union. And leaving the European Union has ended the freedom of movement, contributing to an estimated 20 to 25% of vacancies being unfilled throughout the seafood industry.
I'm asking about fishing.
To quote the Scottish Fisheries Federation, saying that fishing industry in Scotland paid a heavy price for the Brexit deal in the first place. I could go on to say that the deal was desperately poor.
You're quoting
and then
very selectively, because
I'm quoting from the head of the Scottish Fisheries Federation, who wrote to the Prime Minister saying that the deal was desperately poor, generating huge disappointment and a great deal of anger about the failure to deliver on promises repeatedly made to the industry.
That was 5 years ago. And what I'm talking about is the current health of the fishing, Scottish fishing industry.
We don't.
You've talked about salmon. I'm talking about fishing.
We don't want to omit key parts of the facts in relation to the negative impact that Brexit has had on the fishing industry.
Well, I'm
across
contesting
the
that
piece.
because we're having record catches.
To the point in answering Mr Kerr's question about negotiations, there are no details about what either the UK government's or the European Union's wishes are for any potential changes to the fishing regime.
Well, can I interrupt you? Because
no,
in
you
fact,
can't. Because
we do know.
I'm speaking through the chair, and in doing so, I'm finishing my question and saying that as soon as there are any formal positions that the European Union outlines or the United Kingdom government does, I would be happy to update the committee on. I have seen none so far. That issues around fisheries will come up at some point, I have no doubt. And that is what Mr Kerr has reported to the committee today. I don't disagree with that. But the issue as such has not formed any formal part of conversations that I have had with the UK government or indeed with European Union interlocutors. I don't doubt that it will come up as an issue formally at some stage, but it is not formally part of discussions at the present time.
Well, I'm surprised to hear that, because I think it's commonly understood that one of the key asks of the European Commission, the EU, in relation to this review is going to be about improved fishing, access to fishing grounds. And I'm a little surprised, because I generally regard Angus Robertson as one of the most informed Cabinet Secretaries that we have in the Scottish Government, that he doesn't seem to be aware of this fact, given the fact it features in every single report that's ever been published about this whole topic, that fishing rights are on the line. And I hope that he will...
I think, please, We've had the Cabinet Secretary response, so it would be good if you didn't reinterpret that to
Well, that's what I'm here to do.
Heard.
That's my job to interpret what he's saying,
Well,
convener. That's exactly why we have committees.
As
we
we
saw
if you're
with a great example in education
the
yesterday.
witnesses'
So,
contribution. Could I ask a supplementary just before you come back in with around this? So the most recent trade figures have shown that the food and drinks industry have lost exports to Europe by 2/3 since the implementation of Brexit. Part of that, our industry feels, is due to the fact that the Europeans don't feel the same pressures because of the lack of the border controls exhibiting that. If the border controls were implemented, do you think that there would then be an industry swell lobbying the EU side of these negotiations to have a better deal, given that they would be feeling the same pressures, which have resulted in 2/3 of our trade being lost?
So if we think about, I mean, we were talking about seafood, fishing and seafood a moment ago. If we understand how important the export is of Scottish seafood to markets like France or Spain, where time is absolutely of the essence, because seafood needs to be very fresh, and export should happen very quickly. If it were to be the case that the UK government were to introduce border controls that led to any delay in that, it would cause massive problems in that sector. That is why I have said that it is in our interests, Scotland's interests, it is in the UK's interests, and it is in the European Union's interests that one should have an agriculture, food and drink agreement, an SPS agreement, which would obviate the necessity for high-handed border controls, which is what will come in unless there is a deal. So, I'm just suggesting that it would be good for us not to get ahead of ourselves, but to understand that this is perhaps a moment in time where there is an opportunity to reach a good agreement. It doesn't compare with being part of the common market, it does not compare with being part of the single market, it does not compare with being a member state of the European Union. But out of the bad situation that we have found ourselves in that has had a negative impact on the fishing sector in Scotland, maybe as part of these negotiations we can reach an agreement that will ensure the industry against a yet worsening of their situation because of border controls yet to be introduced.
Okay, thank you. Mr Kerr.
right, well, I'll leave the fish behind and move on to talk about what actually was the subject of inquiry, which is about the trade and services. And we learned through evidence presented to the committee that, in fact, there has been a healthy increase in service exports between the United Kingdom and the European Union of 9% compared with 13% for the rest of the world. So I guess I'm going to ask this Cabinet Secretary outright whether he accepts that despite what he might want to believe, and I respect his beliefs, of course, the evidence suggests that, in fact, the service sector has continued to grow rather healthily in terms of the trade that we do between Scotland, the United Kingdom and the EU.
I have no doubt that parts of the service sector have been trading very well, and we should encourage that, and that is exactly what the Scottish Government and its agencies do. I think it would also, however, be fair to say that there are impediments, and we should take the opportunity of reducing those impediments if we can, because I would hope that Mr Kerr and I would agree that there is no artificial ceiling to our ambition in supporting the Scottish service sector. So, whether that relates to recognition, professional recognition of qualifications, whether that relates to the provision of legal services, undoubtedly, there are constraints and there are downsides. I think this has been evidenced to your committee. Yes, there's a difference between services and goods in relation to trade in the European Union. That is a statement of fact. It's also a statement of fact that there are impediments. And so I just think that it's one of those areas, I wouldn't want to downplay them and say they're insignificant and they don't matter because some parts of the sector are doing okay. What I would like to encourage our UK government colleagues in is working out ways in which we can make sure that the parts of the service sector where there are constraints and impediments and where there are technical solutions to them are ones that the UK and EU can reach agreement on.
Well, let me move on to one of those issues which we have looked at, which is mutual recognition of qualifications. We had interesting evidence from a number of different people, experts in their own fields, I have no doubt, including Professor Catherine Bernard of the University of Cambridge, who told us, and I think from my own professional experience I can vouch that this is true, that even when we were in the EU, this is a quote, the mutual recognition provisions did not work terribly well because there is a lot of vested interest in each state to ensure its people get the jobs and professions and that those are not very open to other people. And she cited the legal profession as a good example of that. We've even got that problem within the United Kingdom when it comes to the different jurisdictions between Scotland and England. So does the Cabinet Secretary accept, and certainly I would agree with him, that we want to smooth out any of the rough edges of free trade, and I'm all for free trade, as he well knows, but does he accept that this was a problem before, and therefore there needs to be a lot of work done, regardless of whether we're in the European Union or not, in order to push forward bilateral recognition of professional qualifications? And the one example that was given to us, of course, was the architects, where the architects of the United Kingdom, the architects of the European Union agreed that they would accept each other's qualifications, which is fair and good. And then the European Union said no.
I, yet again, and for the record, agree with Mr Kerr that the challenges around professional qualifications and recognition thereof are things that have been a challenge while we were in the European Union and remain a challenge now that we're no longer in the European Union. Yes, of course, there is self-interest on the part of different countries in and around this issue. Now, having said that, and again I agree with Mr Kerr, that is not a reason to not try and make progress. And if there were decisions that were made in the past that were that didn't try and progress recognition, that were mistaken, that's no reason to not return to them. I would say, though, that you know, we also have an internal UK aspect to this that we need to be aware of. This is not just, and Mr Kerr did, because of course we have different legal jurisdictions, so it's a case in point about the fact that we do have different professional qualifications within the United Kingdom as well. And this makes my point, which is that trade is of course a reserved matter. So we are bound by the actions that the United Kingdom government takes, including the passing of legislation on the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, such as the Professional Qualifications Act of 2022, a UK government act. And trade policy is reserved, but the Professional Qualifications Act 2022 was passed without the legislative consent of Scottish ministers. So when Mr Kerr brings up examples of where there has not been progress made with European Union institutions, I would point out that there have been difficulties within the United Kingdom in this regard. And I would just take this opportunity to underline why this is a really good reason why we should take this opportunity, given that we are able to do this at this moment in time, of trying to make progress on all of these things. And if there is cross-party agreement on this, I very much welcome that. I know that there are Scottish professional bodies who are very closely involved with all of this. I think the committee's heard from the Law Society of Scotland and the Faculty of Advocates. There are others that are also involved in that, and officials from the Scottish Government are engaging regularly with counterparts in the Department for Business and Trade to the same end.
Well, I'm an advocate, as I think, again, the Cabinet Secretary will know, for improved and more clearly defined intergovernmental and indeed interparliamentary relations within the United Kingdom in order to make the state work better for the citizens. I'm all for that. My last question, if I'm permitted, I think I am, is about youth mobility. So I listened to what Angus Robertson says. Again, I do not doubt his sincerity in terms of what he believes about the advantages of improved youth mobility. But that does beg an obvious question. And I know he sits here as Constitution and External Affairs and Culture. But why on earth, if everything that he has said is true, and I don't doubt it is, I also believe in the advantages of youth mobility, why has the Scottish Government done next to nothing to tackle this issue in relation to, for example, the example set by the Welsh Government when it comes to tithe? I mean, tithe is a huge success, and I pay tribute to the Welsh Government for their vision and their ambition and for their and for the pace at which they have implemented a really, I think, successful exchange mechanism programme to complement the Turing scheme. But the Scottish Government, let's be frank, with SEEP, has done nothing. Where's the ambition? Where's the vision? Where is the passion that Angus Robertson quite rightly expended earlier about youth mobility when it comes to something that is well within the competence of the Scottish Government? Next to no money's been spent. It's just been tinkered with. And compared with the Welsh ambition and the Welsh efforts and the Welsh budget for exchange, we're embarrassed, aren't we? Or aren't you?
No, I'm not. I'm not. And I don't accept the characterisation as Mr. Kerr would make it. I mean, there have been efforts to try and find workarounds for the foolhardy UK position of leaving Erasmus+. I stress again, following the pledge that we would remain part of it by the last UK Conservative government. And since that time, we've seen the establishment of a Scottish Education Exchange Programme to support Scottish institutions to develop stronger international partnerships between educational institutions. Following the loss of Erasmus+, we're continuing to seek out the best means to create opportunities for Scottish learners to enjoy international opportunities. Having said that, and having looked very closely at the tithe scheme, which Mr. Kerr has drawn attention to, it is absolutely clear to us that there is no comparison with Erasmus+. If you look at the amount of money that is spent, if one looks at the impact of the tithe scheme when compared with Erasmus previously, there is just no substitute for Erasmus+. And if colleagues would wish me to write in some greater detail to the committee so that one can see the really clear facts about the numbers of students that have been involved, the number of institutions that have been involved, the amount of funding that has been delivered or not delivered by the Turing scheme, and how the tithe scheme compares with all of that, it is clear that the best solution for us here in Scotland is not to try and replicate something which works. It is to be part of the thing that works. And the thing that works is Erasmus+. And here's the good news for Mr. Kerr, is that this is on the table. This is something that the European Union has said that they are open and keen for the United Kingdom to be a part of. And in just the same way as Mr. Kerr rallied to support the United Kingdom's call to rejoin the Horizon programme, I would call on him and everybody else to realise that whilst no doubt people with the best of intentions have tried to make the Turing scheme and have tried to make the tithe scheme make up for the disadvantage of leaving Erasmus+, it does not. So that's why I am not going to be diverted from the position that the Scottish Government has, which is to impress on the UK Government why it is so important to take the opportunity, the offer of rejoining Erasmus+. And the plus is there for a reason. it is a scheme that involves much more than just the ability of students to study in different countries. It has an impact on our wider education system and much more besides. And I would wish young people in Scotland, educational institutions, whether that is at universities and colleges, but also our schools, to be able to be a part of all of that. But I'm happy to write to the committee if you think that would be useful, convener.
I would like Angus Robertson to write to the committee and explain why the Scottish Government have done nothing.
I've already answered that question and said that we have.
You haven't. You've just gone on to a politically inspired description. So I would, what I would really like to know is if the Welsh Government, with a much smaller budget, smaller population, can commit £65 million to tithe, 15,000 young people from Wales participating in exchanges, 10,000 international participants coming to Wales. I mean, the Scottish Government have spent a grand total of £2 million just in 2 years. So that's £1 million a year, focusing on what? We don't even know how many young people have been involved with SEEP. Why has the Scottish Government not even bothered at all? Angus Robertson passionately believes in youth mobility.
Mr Kerr, this is really veering into the education aspect of these things. It's not relevant
youth mobility.
Well,
part of youth mobility. We had evidence from Tithe. We asked Tithe directly whether they'd had any interaction with any representative of the Scottish Government.
I think we have to also acknowledge that our Scottish students have accessed the Turing system as well.
They have.
But I'm going to move on, if that's okay.
Vina, with your permission, can I just help Mr Kerr's lack of knowledge in this area by drawing his attention to the fact that the Welsh Government, the Welsh Labour Government, have publicly said that they would welcome the United Kingdom Government entering into discussions with the European Union about rejoining Erasmus+. I think that answers the point about which scheme is best, which approach is best. The position of the Scottish Government is that rejoining Erasmus+ is where we would wish to be. Thank you.
Convener, I am asking questions of the Cabinet Secretary because he is here to account for the performance of the Scottish Government when it comes to youth mobility compared with the other devolved government on the island of Great Britain. We have done nothing compared with the Welsh. And yet, the Cabinet Secretary, rightly, I think, is enthused about the idea of youth mobility, but actually has done nothing about it. So, my last question in this area...
Well, I'm going to move on. I'll come back to you, Mr Kerr, if you still have time, but there are other members who wish to come in. Ms Dunbar.
Your last question, Mr Kerr. I've been listening very intently to what the Cabinet Secretary has been saying today, and being a substitute member, please forgive me if I don't get things completely correct. I believe that my view is that the UK's exit from the EU has negatively impacted both the outward and inward mobility of Scottish and EU students. I think if you look back at the data that I've looked at, Scottish students in the past were the most mobile across the four nations in the UK. So it's had a negative impact that they've no longer been able to have the ability to do that. And when they were able to do it, the unemployment was lower amongst those who participated in the mobility scheme than those that hadn't. And I believe that out of the subjects that were looked into, those that had taken the gone into the mobility programme, their salaries were higher in most cases. You said previously, Cabinet Secretary, that you were pleased to hear about the Conservative UK Government reaching agreement regarding the Horizon programme, and you would be keen to see that happen with Erasmus Plus, Creative Europe and Mobility. Do you believe it can be done?
Yes, I absolutely believe it can be done, because when we're dealing with the facts as opposed to the rhetoric that we've heard from some quarters this morning, it's absolutely obvious that there is no comparison between UK schemes, whether that is Turing or the Tithe scheme, and Erasmus plus. Between 2014 and 2020, Scottish universities were awarded on average €12.1 million euros per year through Erasmus plus. Scottish universities are currently awarded less than half that value, just over £5 million, through the Turing scheme, and they are also becoming less competitive at securing funding for mobility. Dealing with the scale of the challenge, I think it's important that we acknowledge the facts. UCAS data shows that between 2016 and 2024, there has been an 81% decrease, 81% decrease in the number of EU domiciled acceptances at Scottish universities. The largest decrease in EU acceptance came in 2021, which coincided with a change in student support for EU students. And we expect the 23-24 figures to be published while this committee session is actually in process, and we expect a further decline in the number of EU students. And just a final point for the record, so that everybody has the facts at their disposal. The loss of Erasmus Plus funding is greater than just the impact on universities. For example, in the final year of Scotland's last Erasmus Plus cycle, £26.4 million was awarded across Scotland's education sector. In the current year of the Turing scheme, Scottish institutions have been awarded £6.9 million. It should be obvious to all of us, that the Turing scheme and indeed the Tithe scheme are not a match for being part of the Erasmus Plus programme. And the good news, and that's why the context of this evidence session at this time, at this point of the discussions, the early discussions, which are about to take place on a more formal basis, is that being part of Erasmus Plus is on the table and on offer from the European Union. And if we were to listen to our institutions, whether our universities or the wider education sector, they would be telling, and they have told you, how much they would wish to be part of the Erasmus Plus programme. And that is why the Scottish Government is making that point to the UK Government. I should say, incidentally, it's...
on that and what exactly has been engagement has been.
Well, this is where my initial update for the committee about, I think the engagement and the tone of the engagement has been good. What is more difficult to understand is where the relative priorities of the UK government are. That was Mr Bibby's question, and it's a good question, to which we don't know the answer to. And I think there's a degree of trying to work out what does the other side, what's the European Union's emerging position going to be, what is the UK's emerging position going to be, and where might there be trade-offs and things. And this is where, going back to Mr Harvey's initial questions about process and where do we fit in, that is the uncertainty of the situation that we have, which is effectively ad hoc. So at least we're being invited to attend meetings, at least we are being told that we are being listened to. What isn't yet apparent is the extent to which negotiations will be occurring on our behalf. Because it is true to say that Scottish institutions and Scottish students were much... there was a much higher preponderance of those taking up the likes of places in Erasmus+. So it might be viewed by others that it's less of a priority for them than it might be for us. We're trying to impress on the UK government that it's not just a financial decision, it's also about goodwill. Because it's not just about Scottish students being able to study elsewhere in Europe, it's about European Union students being able to study here. And if we've seen an 81% drop, as we have, and those numbers have been made up, but only in part, and they are from other countries and other parts of the world that bring with them challenges as well. We look at the biggest single international cohort of students in Edinburgh now come from the People's Republic of China. I think we should be looking very closely at ways in which we can support our universities and the international student cohort that is very important for them, and being part of Erasmus Plus would help do that.
Thank you.
Dr Mushla wants to come in, Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh.
Dr Mushla, you're muted.
No sound at the moment.
Apologies. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. It was just say, Cabinet Secretary mentioned the statistics that were going to be published today. They have actually just come out, and they show that for Scotland, EU student enrolments have decreased by 21% this year, and we've seen non-EU student enrolments decrease by 10%. So this is the 6th year in a row where EU student numbers have decreased. So I just thought I'd add that.
It is worse than 81%. So that should give us all cause for concern.
Cabinet Secretary, I just wanted to talk about the exchange that Erasmus gives to educational institutes themselves. I was able to attend New College Lanarkshire's celebration of its international work, representations for over 20 countries that they're involved with, where they're doing an outreach in delivering nursing and dental training, giving the opportunities for the lecturers to get involved. And we also had the Comenius teacher exchange in the past that was run through the British Council. So how important are these aspects of an exchange programme for Scotland's education and further and higher education?
I think it's a very good point, Convener, because we've been talking a lot about student numbers and student experience and the opportunity and advantages of studying in other countries, and the fact that a more significant proportion of students from a deprived background in Scotland were able to take part in that than was the case from elsewhere. But this also has a direct and indirect impact on those that teach in our educational institutions. And as we know, we have benefited over the decades from a very significant part of our university and college lecturing staff coming from other European Union countries. And I think one of the concerns that I've got is, as we have been able to witness the decline and significant decline in European Union students coming here, I fear that we're going to have the same impact on our teaching staff from other European Union countries. And I think that is something that should give us all cause for concern. We want the best teaching staff from everywhere in the world to come and work in Scotland, but anything that would lead to a decline in academics working here from other European Union countries would be a concern for us, and we've been able to observe the beginnings of a trend with that as well.
It was SEEK funded, most of the work that was done by the college, which obviously with an area like my own constituency, where there's high levels of deprivation, that onward journey through the further education colleges is so vital, and they really do a wonderful job at trying to keep those links together. Can I bring in Mr Bibby? Thank you.
Convener, just to go back to the that topic about Erasmus replacements and the SEEK programme. You started earlier, Cabinet Secretary, by saying the Scottish Government wanted much deeper and much wider reaching agreements in cooperation with the European Union. And I do think, following on from Mr Kerr's question, there are questions about given that rhetoric, and I appreciate the Scottish Government has not done nothing, but 36 projects from SEEK compared to 199 in Tithe, there is a significant difference there. Why the Scottish Government, given its stated position on having much more close relations and cooperation, hasn't done even nearly as much as the Welsh Labour Government have in terms of the Tithe programme. I understand what you're saying there about earlier about maybe it's not a replacement for Erasmus Plus fully, but that isn't really a logical explanation as to why you're not even repeating what the Welsh scheme have done. Why has the Scottish Government not replicated the Erasmus scheme as much as the Welsh Government has?
Yeah, so we're meeting at a moment in time where on the table we have the opportunity of rejoining Horizon Plus. That is the context for my evidence session. That is the context for the interministerial discussions that I've been having with Nick Simmons-Thomas. And we can go over the old ground of the interventions that the Scottish Government has made and relative to other schemes that have existed elsewhere, but I would have hoped that all reasonable and rational understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the schemes that are available have made it patently obvious to anybody that there is no substitute for being part of Erasmus+. Now, that given the fact that that is something viewed by European Union interlocutors, and very importantly so, in exactly the same way as Horizon and Creative Europe are not viewed as cherry-picking by the European Union, as in these are schemes that are on the table if the United Kingdom wants to play a part in. And that's why I would appeal to colleagues of other political parties in this question, because I do think there are differences of views about this within the UK government. I think it's true to say that those who have a particular educational and cultural perspective within the UK government are very keen for the UK to rejoin Erasmus+. I'm not sure that that is necessarily the case in the Treasury, and that's why I would appeal to colleagues who have a voice to use it to make the case why Erasmus Plus is something that we should go back into.
But the question is, why have we done less than Wales?
We've done something different to Wales, and I can go through the things that. But as part of this process, we've been looking at Turing, we've been looking at Tithe, and we've been looking at Erasmus Plus, and saying there is no point. And this is underlined by the fact that the Welsh government is saying to the UK government that it wishes the UK to look at going back into the Erasmus Plus programme. This is my point. There is no substitute, Mr. Bibby, for this. So why don't we all agree, if we do, I hope we do, that Erasmus Plus is the best show in town in this, and rather than going off and trying to replicate something that cannot deliver in the same way as Erasmus Plus does, let's focus our attention on getting back into Erasmus Plus, saying to the UK government we care about this, we think this is important, and to say to European Union colleagues, as part of a wider mobility approach, that we are in favour of Erasmus Plus, and we're in favour of young people being able to be mobile between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and that would seem to me to be a fair deal for everybody that is part of the process.
And what, if any, is there a plan for SEEP going forward?
I would have to write to Mr. Bibby about what happens post this round of negotiations. I'm working on the basis that we can persuade our colleagues to make progress with this, and that will impact very much on how things would go forward after that stage. If we were to know that Erasmus Plus is going ahead, then that will have a significant impact on the work that we currently undertake.
You mentioned, final question, if I may.
Cabinet Secretary, it'd be helpful if you wrote to the committee. We can share it with Mr. Bibby. Thank you.
Indeed.
You mentioned in one of the previous questions about concerns coming from the Treasury in relation to costs. In terms of why Scotland hasn't replicated the Welsh model, is that because of cost implications? Are there concerns coming from the Finance Department and the Scottish Government about spending more money on this area?
I've not seen any correspondence that would support what Mr. Bibby is saying there. Obviously, these kind of schemes come with a cost implication. Of course they do. Of course they do. But I do think that we have to take a step back and look objectively at the strengths and weaknesses of all of the schemes that are out there. And that is, it is true that we should consider the cost implications of these things. There is, however, also an intangible benefit that you cannot you cannot conclude on the basis of cost about its value. And I think the value for a generation of young people who have been denied the opportunity of a year abroad or furthering their studies in other countries, both for Scottish and wider UK students and European Union students who wish to come here, just at a time and a context, and we have talked about this in passing, where we are looking at the situation in Ukraine with the gravest of concern. The Europe in which we all grew up in, with certainties around peace and security, unfortunately, are over. And that is why schemes like Erasmus Plus that bring people together, that helps grow understanding and trust between emerging generations of our younger society, I think are really, really important. Again, another reason why we should be part of a scheme at scale which does much more than Turing or Tithe could do ever.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Like Mr Kerr, I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary is not responsible for education, but if we are able to have further information, that would be helpful.
Thank you. Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to move on to another topic before we come to an end. Earlier on in the second half of this inquiry, before we got deep into the youth mobility issues, we did hear some evidence on issues relating to energy, and I wonder if you could reflect on that. This is, in particular, the emission trading scheme, and this is an area where there is a degree of co-decision making because the ETS isn't wholly reserved. There's an authority on which the Scottish Government is represented, which makes some decisions. And we heard some evidence suggesting that unless there is alignment between the UK ETS and the EU ETS, there will be an impact on businesses trading in and out of the EU from January next year. I wonder if you could tell us what the Scottish Government's position is on that, what the status of that work is, and also whether there's a concern that if a trade agreement was reached with a far-right US regime which promotes climate denial conspiracy theories, which clearly would not be likely to include a carbon price in products entering the UK market, whether there could be harmful impacts from that.
So I fear that I won't be able to do justice to Mr Harvey's question in the less than a minute that I have for the committee evidence session, but I want to assure him that I and colleagues are very, very seized of this matter. There are obvious interests for the UK government in reaching energy agreements about trading, around carbon capture and storage, around interconnectivity, about regulatory alignment to make sure that the energy sector can operate as well as possible, and we're very supportive of that. One of the things, I think Mr Harvey knows this, one of the things that I spend a lot of my time doing when I meet with continental European colleagues, primarily Northern European colleagues, is drawing attention to the opportunities that we have as Northern European renewable energy-rich countries, whether that is Scotland, Ireland, Iceland, Norway, Denmark and others, who are all likely to be energy exporting countries, that we work as closely as possible to make the case to other European countries that we need to work together. And that is why we need to deal with these regulatory issues and trade-related issues and interconnectivity-related issues. And I am trying to impress on my UK government colleagues, this is why when they are talking with EU member states and European Union institutions about all of this, they have to remember the priorities that we have here in Scotland as a country that will be able to produce green hydrogen without nuclear being part of our energy setup, exporting hydrogen through the European Union's hydrogen backbone, a system which links Ireland and Scotland to the European Union via Scotland. So we have to understand, and it's not been widely reflected on the Scottish media or indeed in debates in the Chamber as far as I've been able to ascertain, that we are in a really, really strong position if we can have regulatory alignment, if we can have interconnectivity, and if we can realise that Europe, as it changes from gas dependency to hydrogen, is a massive opportunity for us as well as for continental Europe.
The point on hydrogen infrastructure is certainly relevant, but perhaps out with the scope of this inquiry. But the ETS alignment, if there's any further update that the Cabinet Secretary can give us in writing on the status of work on that, I think that would be helpful. So
just to say, Convener, and briefly, that we are in a position, of course, to share with you the energy paper that has been developed, which covers a lot of the points that Mr Harvey has raised, and we'd be happy to forward that to the committee and any follow-up questions that there might be.
Thank you.
Okay, can I just also worth mentioning again that the outcome statement from the PPA looked at the emissions, and it's seen as a priority of both sides to come to some sort of arrangement around CBAM or a different mechanism for that position. Cabinet Secretary, have you got time for just to bring Mr Kerr in for his final question? If you can be quick.
That is very generous of you, Convener. Unexpected opportunity. The UK Youth Mobility Visa, this is a yes-no answer actually, so this will please the Cabinet Secretary. The UK Youth Mobility Visa as it stands, would the Cabinet Secretary welcome that being extended to all of the EU nations as a step towards improving the youth mobility that you spoke about?
I think I would have to... Sorry, this is going to be he's invited me to give a yes-no answer when I think it would be more sensible for me to understand what the different relative positions would be. If that would be the position of the UK government, what would the position of the European Union institutions be in relation to that? So as soon as I have greater clarification on that, I'd be happy to come back to...
It already exists, and it already operates on a bilateral basis with a number of countries.
I'm trying to make the point, Convener, that we're, as I've said to the committee, we're about to learn a lot more about what the position of the UK government is.
What's your position on the...
My position is, asking me to talk in concrete terms about a UK government scheme that may change because of the basis of the proposals that are about to be undertaken, I would prefer to reserve my position to look at the proposals for an enhanced scheme relative to that which is currently in place.
So, Mr Kerr, this morning.
Would appear to be.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials and Dr Mushler in particular for joining us from the Brussels office. Can I say that the Brussels office were very helpful to the committee at our recent visit to the PPA, and thank them once again for that. We now go into private session, and I close this session of the Parliament.